I'm Dr. Sarah Boyce. I'm the Director of Research and Education at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. And it's my absolute honor and privilege today to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Tiya Miles. Dr. Miles is a Harvard University professor of history, the Radcliffe Alumni Professor at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and Director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History. She is a public and academic historian and a creative writer whose work explores the intersections of African American, Native American, and women's histories in the context of place. She has become increasingly focused on ecological questions, a subject near and dear to my heart, environmental storytelling, and ways of articulating and enlivening African American environmental eco-consciousness. Dr. Miles is the author of 7 books, and the only current 2-time winner of Yale's Frederick Douglass Prize for the study of slavery, abolition, and resistance. She has earned numerous prizes, accolades, and funding support for her important work, including a MacArthur Foundation Genius Award Fellowship. Today, we all have the honor and privilege to have her with us, and I look forward to listening and learning more. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tiya Miles.
So I was really shocked last year. I was very touched to see people coming out to hear about what was then my latest book, which is titled All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake. And last year, Mary and I had a dialogue. Hi. Hi.
Maybe that might work better, I don't know.
How's this, you all? A little better? Okay. So last year, Mary and I had a dialogue about that book. Maybe a few of you were there. And so I see nods. Great. So I thought that I would start with that book, which is a history, and then kind of hop over to my latest book, which is a novel. And I wanted to just chat with you for maybe 20 minutes or so about the process that I enter into when I work on history and when I work on fiction, kind of the struggles that I've experienced moving between genres, and the reasons why I have decided that as much as I love doing history, I need to also work within fiction. So my comments are really going to be about history and fiction, their relationship, kind of the borders between them, and my sense of scarcity and excess that leads me to want to move across that border and to work in both genres. So I'll start with All That She Carried, and for those of you who aren't familiar with that book, it's the history of an object and also a group of people, a line of African American women who had a special relationship to that object. The object is now known as Ashley Sack, and it is a 19th century agricultural bag made of a very plain cotton weave, which was used by an enslaved woman named Rose to, as I argue in the book, rescue her daughter, who was about to be sold away from her. The daughter's name was Ashley, and Ashley was only 9 years old when the people who owned both her and her mother, Rose, decided to sell Ashley. And they sold her because the patriarchal figure of the household had just passed away, and this was a very common practice in the South that when an enslaver died, their property would sometimes be liquidated. And that property did include human beings often. At the time that Rose learned that Ashley was to be sold, she got a hold of this cotton sack and she packed it with a number of items that she was able to obtain. She packed into the sack a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, and a braid of her own hair. And she also packed love into that sack. We know this because a descendant of Rose and Ashley named Ruth Middleton embroidered this story onto the sack itself. And some of you may have already seen this sack on exhibit because it was in the Smithsonian African American Museum for a little while. It is very soon going to be on display in the new Charleston African American International Museum. Oh, I see smiles back there. All right. So it had been in storage for a while, but now it's going to be visible again. So that was the focus of the book that I talked about here at this festival last summer, the sack, and also the women who packed the sack, who used the sack, who passed it down, and who embroidered it, turning it into a work of art and also a historical record through their actions. When I was working on all that she carried, I encountered a great deal of scarcity. I encountered a number of gaps in the historical documentation and in the historical record, which is again not uncommon in the history of slavery in this country. Enslaved people were often barred legally from learning how to read and to write. They didn't, therefore, often have the skills to create their own records. And if they did have the skills, they didn't have the time, the resources to produce their own records. And if records were produced by them, those records were very unlikely to have been viewed as valuable by those who preserved records at the time. They were more likely to have been lost than records produced by or about people who were in power. So it was very difficult to reconstruct the history of Ashley Sack and to identify the woman who was the mother Rose, the child who was the daughter Ashley, and less difficult, but still tricky, to identify and understand more about their descendant Ruth, who embroidered the sack. And here's where I come to a place where history and fiction overlapped for me. When I was working on that book, and when I realized that I was not going to have the vast range of documentary material that I really needed and wanted to tell that story in all of its richness and detail, well, first I panicked, and I wondered, could I really make a book of this, or would I need to turn back, make a new plan, perhaps try to publish an academic article about it instead? But I knew that the artifact itself and the story of the mother and the daughter, the story of African American familial love and perseverance was actually too important and too moving to be hidden away in some academic journal. And I wanted to write the book that could perhaps find a broader readership. And so I had to find a way to step into those gaps. I had to find a way to contend with the scarcity of the lack in the documentary record. And I don't really know how this happened, but somehow as I was thinking and writing, the many texts that I read when I was studying African American literature as an undergraduate started just coming to the front of my mind. These novels were coming to the fore, and poetry was coming to the fore, and passages and phrases were just coming to the front of my mind, which seemed to help to get at and understand and then to explain the inner experience of this mother Rose and her daughter Ashley, and of their granddaughter and great-granddaughter Ruth. And so I found myself doing something that is kind of strange in historical research and writing, especially in the academy. And that is, I was quoting from fiction all the time in the history. And then I started to see the embroidered text on the sack itself as a work of literature, really as a poem. And then I started to think more in a poetic vein, and all of a sudden I had these passages that were much more creative and experimental than I would have expected going into the project. So in that book, the expectations of the historical discipline around the need for a documentary record and for written evidence really could not be met. I had to find an alternative, and fiction provided me with that alternative. Fiction provided me with a way to enter into the lack with a very different kind of fullness, which was an experiential fullness and also an emotional fullness. And in the end, I felt very satisfied with the marriage of historical methods and with literary components in the book, even though, of course, I still wish that I could have been able to find more written evidence of a documentary style. I have now published a novel. It's called The Cherokee Rose, and it has quite a lot in common with All That She Carried, in that it is a novel that is set in the plantation South. It's also a novel that's very concerned with contemporary questions and issues. And it's a novel that spans the borders of history and fiction. And I would say that in working on The Cherokee Rose, that relationship between history and fiction was sort of flipped. That novel emerged from years of research that I conducted into the question of African American and Native American relationships in the 19th century, and a topic that is unfamiliar to many people, which is the enslavement of people of African descent, of Black people in Native American nations of the Southeast and Indian Territory, which is now eastern Oklahoma. So I've been researching that for a number of years. My dissertation was on that topic. I wrote 2 books on that topic. And while doing that work, the academic work, the research on the grounds and in the archives, I also found myself hitting up against a sense of scarcity. But with that work, the scarcity or the lack or the gap was around the history of women within the subject area. It was around the history of the intimacies, which were sometimes violent and sometimes affectionate, which occurred in this context. And it was a scarcity or a lack around an understanding of this history and the ways in which this history has informed present-day contemporary African American identities and Afro-Native relationships. That contemporary issue really had to do with the question, which some of you may have read about or seen in news coverage over recent years. The question of whether or not descendants of Black people or Afro-Native people who had been owned by Native Americans as slaves should or would have citizenship in those tribal nations today. That's been an ongoing issue for the last several years, even for the last few decades. And the various Native American nations that did hold Black people as slaves, as property, have taken different pathways toward trying to determine how they would view the descendants of those they had formerly enslaved. Some of those tribal nations have still refused to offer citizenship to those descendants. Some of those tribal nations are on the way toward that path. The Cherokee Nation is at the forefront of fully accepting the descendants of formerly enslaved people as citizens in their nation. So one of the areas of lack or scarcity that I experienced in doing this research was that many people didn't understand this, and there was a lot of confusion and division and tension among and between the various parties involved. Thank you. Just to offer one example, I found in my research that government officials in some of these tribal nations were often hesitant to recognize that their nations had not only condoned slavery, but had benefited from slavery. Governmental officials in these tribal nations often didn't want to recognize that slavery was indeed harsh and exploitative in their nations, and that slavery did contribute to the wealth of those nations. And on the flip side of that, there were a number of African Americans and Afro-Native people. And by that term, I mean people who are both of African and indigenous descent and/or have very strong cultural ties across those groups. I found that many people in these groups were also hesitant to recognize the reality of this history, and that African Americans preferred to hold on to a story which really emphasized the notion that Native Americans had always helped African Americans, had accepted them when they were trying to escape from slavery, had adopted them into their communities, and so on. So I was doing this research for a number of years, and I found myself in a number of circumstances where I noticed these gaps or this lack and a confusion resulting from it. And I also noticed during this period of research what I will call an excess. And this was an excess of emotion, just a lot of feeling. I mean, a feeling of resentment and anger, feelings of longing, desire, on both sides and all sides of this issue. And sometimes that longing and those emotions would be expressed by other people who were on the same research trail as I was. One example that comes to mind is actually, it's a sad example, but it's a true example, and I think it's very revealing. And this was an example of someone who was doing research in the Oklahoma Historical Society, as was I. And this person thought of themselves, had identified as white. This person was from the white family and identified as white, but thought they might have had Native American ancestry. They were in the archives in Oklahoma, searching the records for the Native American ancestry. And they found out that actually instead, what they had was Black ancestry stemming from people who had been enslaved by Native Americans. So their ancestor showed up in the Native American records, but their ancestor was not Native American. I remember seeing this person being extremely disappointed about that finding, which is, it's a difficult commentary about race, and there's a lot more that we could say about racial categories, identification, associations, romanticization, exoticization, stigma. I mean, these are cross-cutting issues across these groups. But in this instance, Native American ancestry was elevated and African American ancestry was denigrated. And there was a lot of feeling and emotionality connected up with that. So I wrote 2 histories about slavery in the Cherokee Nation, and I had a lot left over. This was the excess. The excess was sort of the emotion, the feeling, the contemporary issues that stem from these histories that seem so fuzzy and amorphous, and yet so vexing for people. And I knew that I was also feeling these things. I was also just having a lot of emotions about this research, all the way around, just all the way around. And one reason for my reaction was that I am one of those people, one of the many African Americans who has a family story that's been passed down through the generations about Native American ancestry. Now, let me be clear in saying that for some people, this is absolutely the case, and they have Native American ancestry. But I don't think my family actually does. I think I know my grandmother believed it because she told me and she told all the cousins, and my grandmother is the most honest person, in the world. I mean, she's now gone, but always with me. But I don't think that the evidence would bear that out. I think that this was a part of sort of a story that many African Americans carry about our ancestry, which we carry because Native Americanness has, in some ways, but not always, you all, please hear me saying that, been elevated in this culture. And many people would rather be, quote, Indian than, quote, Black. I also think that many African Americans carried the story and passed it down because we know deep within ourselves and across the generations that we were taken from our, true and original homeland. Perhaps we can't pinpoint that place because of slavery, right? But we know in broad terms that those homelands would have been in West Africa or West Central Africa. So we know that we don't really belong here. And that refusal of belonging for Black people has continued across the centuries, just across the centuries, being perpetuated by laws and policies and customs of the United States. So I think that Black people and Black families sometimes reach for these stories of Native American ancestry as a way to feel that we belong on this land authentically. So I was feeling a lot too, and that stuff had to go somewhere. I wasn't going to put it in a history because I feel very loyal to my understanding of what history is to be about and what the historical method involves. I feel very loyal to the idea that when we are engaging in historical research, we will ask a research question, we will cast our net as far and wide as possible to gather all the sources and evidence that we can find. We will, cross-check and cross-reference and, piece together that evidence. We will interpret what we see as having taken place in the past. We will try to offer argumentation about cause and effect and change over time, and we will present it in a way that allows our readers or our listeners or our colleagues to be able to double check us, to track that down. This is kind of funny, but I was telling Mary Bergman that before coming over here, I was in a total frenzy because I'm working on a piece on Juneteenth that's going to be coming out in the next couple of days in a newspaper. And one of the sites I talk about is the Nantucket African Meeting House, just by the way. And the fact checker started emailing me at 2 p.m. So I was rushing to try to send her my sources, and I was telling her, I'm in Nantucket, I don't have my books. So then I thought, okay, my daughter's back at home in Cambridge. I can get my daughter to take photographs of the books that I use and send it to the fact checker. Should I admit this? Yes, I will. This was going on until about 3:15. And I might tell the fact checker, I have just got to go. But this is what I think history is about. That's what we do. We do our best to work within the realm of fact, and even though we can't always know what these facts are in total clarity or with total certainty, that's what we're working with. I mean, that is our currency. But for me, working with just the so-called facts of this history of African American, Native American relationship and slavery was not going to be enough. I was just feeling too much, and everybody I encountered on every side of the issue was feeling too much. We were feeling so much that it's almost as if we couldn't contain that emotion, and that's when the fights would happen. I won't go into this too much right now, but I have been to some conferences where there have been some knockdown dragouts of people yelling across the auditorium about this issue. Yeah, really, I have. I know. And so I wanted all of this extra material, this excess, to go somewhere, and I wanted to be able to kind of channel it into those spaces of lack or scarcity that I was seeing in our contemporary moment when it comes to this issue. And so I wrote this novel, The Cherokee Rose, in which I place contemporary characters who all have these different ideas about who they are and what their ancestry is and what does it mean to be Black and what does it mean to be Native and who gets to call themselves what. I have them all drawn to a Cherokee plantation in what's now Georgia. And this is a place that I've actually spent a lot of time at, where I've done a lot of research. I've written a book about this plantation, so I know it well. So I had these characters coming to this plantation and finding themselves in a situation and in an emotional realm and actually a spiritual realm that they did not expect and that they think they are not prepared for. And what that realm is won't surprise you. It's the realm of the past. History emerges up from the ground in this place. The plantation is just steeped in the lives and the emotions of the people who lived there 200 years before, such that the women who arrive in our time cannot ignore it. They have to confront it, and although they are very different from different backgrounds with different stakes in the matter, they end up having to confront it together because they are facing various threats to themselves and also to the plantation, which they realize over time that they need to be the protectors of. I will say, just in the last moment before I stop chatting at you and ask you to chat back to me, that the way that the historical time comes into the novel is via a ghost. The ghost is a figure who I did a lot of research about, an Afro Creek, that is an Afro Muskogee girl who was on the plantation and who comes back to let these women in the present day know that they need to stop bickering with each other and turn their focus to some serious business. One of the things that she does is she kind of guides them to the discovery of a source, which is a diary that had been written by a German-American missionary on the plantation in the 1800s. And when they read this diary, the women in the present time understand this place so much better, understand each other so much better, and end up leading completely different lives. So I'm going to end there, and thank you so much for your attention. So do you have thoughts, questions, comments? Yes. I love that first question. Right out of the gate. Right out of the gate. So there was a real diary. There was a real diary written by an incredibly interesting Moravian woman whose name was Anna Rosina Gambold. There's so much I would love to say about Anna Rosina. There's so much. Okay, I will just say that she was Georgia's first botanist, as far as somebody who was researching plants and writing down the findings of her research and sending her findings, all around to other scientists. She was a very strong believer in what was her Christian faith in the Moravian Church. And she ended up getting married. This is all true, you all. Okay, what I'm telling you right now. She ended up getting married to another Moravian missionary named John Gambold because she felt that she was being called to evangelize to Native Americans. And so she got married in response to kind of a spiritual calling. Anna Rosina Gambold did. She went to the Cherokee Nation. She lived there for many decades. She ended up actually dying there. And yes, she wrote a diary. It is a splendid diary. She was an incredible observer. She wrote almost every day. And one of the things that really struck me when I was doing my research on this plantation, the historical research, and when I was reading her diary, was that among all the diarists from that mission, she was the one who actually noticed Black people. She was the one who noticed Cherokee women. She was the one who wrote down, "This is Grace," or "This is Michael," or "This is David," and their daughter was just sold. She was the one who described an enslaved woman who had lost her feet due to frostbite after being forced to travel across country in the slave trade, and had to crawl across the grounds of the Van Plantation in order to carry out her forced/assigned tasks. Anna Rosina Gambold wrote all this down. And so that diary was definitely my starting point for this novel. I reinvented it, and I worked with her as an historical figure and tried to think about, could it have been possible for Anna Rosina Gambold to actually change her racial views? Could it have been possible for this historical figure to have befriended the Black and Native women around her? Because in the actual diary, she writes in a way that maybe it could have happened. But in truth and in the reality, Anna Rosina Gambold was in charge of enslaved laborers because the Moravian Church held Black people as slaves and purchased Black people from Cherokee people to work in the Moravian mission. So Anna Rosina Gambold, the historical figure, was surrounded by enslaved Black people. She could not have done her part of running the mission without their labor. I think she knew this, given the degree of detail in her writing, but she never actually goes as far to say in her diary something like, "These people should be free. They should have the liberty that I have." Yes?
Perhaps it was her empathy that she wrote down.
Mm-hmm.
She knew she couldn't do anything about it, she had to be silenced, but her empathy was in the diary.
I feel like you've already read the novel, writer. Because it's that perhaps that I was working with. And that perhaps gets to this topic of emotion and feeling that I'm talking about, and sort of where it exists in history, where it exists in the past, where it can exist in fiction in a way that I don't feel very comfortable making it appear, in history. Because yes, I think that her empathy is all over that diary. And maybe in the novel, there is a way for her to actually act on it. I'm not going to say for sure because I want you to read it. Oh, yes.
Did writing Turkey Rose, did it help to fill some of the emotional gap for you?
Oh, thank you for asking that. It has. It has. Um, but maybe not in ways that you would expect because I set this up talking about my grandmother and her story. And I think that I actually have been, I know that I've been working through and thinking about that for many years, and I've written about it in various ways in essay form. But part of what I have been able to work out emotionally in the novel is actually a piece of it that has to do with relationships among women, which has to do with differences and resentments and the ways in which the women sometimes take these things out on each other and also on their own bodies. So through writing these characters and actually trying to allow them to, throw their mess, around the pages, I've been able to think through some of that.
I think it's probably an important dialogue. Thank you for that.
No, thank you. Oh, yes, in the back.
Thank you so much, Tyler. This is so incredible. And my question is about, as someone who's writing history and fiction, um, and thinking about how often women's narratives were left out of the historical record, and thinking about work like Celia Hartman is doing and like what you're doing, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the gendering of fiction. Does fiction become the realm where women can find their narratives, their stories, and then is that why we get comments like, fiction is lies or fiction is right? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Wow, that is such an interesting question. I think that you raise an important caution, actually, with that. Because, I don't know if chick lit is still a term or category that people use. I don't know if that's current, but I remember that, swirling around. And that term always felt pejorative to me. Maybe think about, going back to the middle 1800s, 1850s in this country, and Nathaniel Hawthorne talking about all those scribbling women, that is, women novelists whose works were doing much better than his were. And I think that we should be careful and we should be aware of kind of drawing a hard line that says, here's the history and that's the real stuff. And here's fiction. And these are the fantastical and soft imaginings of women. No, I agree with what may have been behind your question. And I am certainly a proponent for people actually blurring that border and bringing some of the questions and strategies and even the feeling across that line. Yes?
Tricky question, but I think you alluded to it in some questioning. When you talked about the younger women more bickering and then learning about their past, and I'm wondering through the diary, are you talking about epigenetics, the concept of epigenetics, and this emotional inheritance that they all share, and that's what they're not getting in touch with people?
That is an interesting question. I would say that I'm not dealing with epigenetics per se. I mean, the idea that there's something passed down in the genes and there's an overlay on top of that that gets expressed. Because I'm not so certain about how that works, or if we can kind of trust kind of the assertions. Okay, about that. But I will say that DNA plays a large role in this novel because DNA is a very popular way that people try to not only find their roots, but often to find their Native American roots. And we have seen in some high-profile examples that many Native tribal citizens really disavow this method and basically say something to the effect of, this is a summary. If you have to find out that you're Native through a DNA test that tells you some kind of distant percentage of ancestry, then you're not Native. Because Indigenous citizenship is actually a political category, and Indigenous belonging has to do with that political category, by which I mean tribal citizenship to a great extent, but also real, lived out, kind of enacted relationship with a family and with a community. And so DNA is a hot button item.
Emotional inheritance is not that kind of DNA, it's really the emotional.
Right.
And I think that is what
That is what I'm talking about. Absolutely, the emotional inheritance, which, because it's emotional, doesn't have to be passed down through a single family line or a bloodline. And that's one thing I try to show in the novel, which is that our families can be much broader than what any DNA test or even family tree might tell us.